The Lumix S5 Mark II might be one of the coolest cameras I've seen lately. Now, I haven't used it. I haven't bought one. I don't know what it's like to actually shoot with the thing, but on paper, this camera has my attention. But I'm also gonna talk about why I haven't bought one just yet. The S5 Mark II, if you don't know, is a full frame Lumix camera, and it was the introduction of phase detect in the Lumix full frame ecosystem. Phase detect, if you're familiar with the concept, is way better than previous contrast, depth from defocus, autofocus systems that Lumix, Panasonic were using. Sony, Canon, basically everyone was going to phase detect, and Lumix for the longest time was the holdout saying, no, contrast, depth from defocus is the holy grail. It's not. Lumix has been notoriously bad at autofocus, but finally they've embraced phase detect. There's a whole bunch of behind the scenes that I'm really not all that familiar with. Maybe some drama as far as who Panasonic gets their sensors from, and if they're buying sensors from Sony. There may have been I don't know. I don't know any of that. All I know is that Lumix finally has phase detect on a full frame camera. Lumix is not known for full frame cameras. For the longest time, they were kind of the pioneers of mirrorless with Micro Four Thirds. And before Micro Four Thirds, there was 4/3. But Micro Four Thirds, the mirrorless digital kind of pinnacle of video in a hybrid camera, which is my focus. I love taking photos, but I love shooting video. And Micro Four Thirds has just had that. All the great features that I want, like shutter angle, anamorphic, high quality bit rates and codecs. Micro Four Thirds has been incredible. And there's great lenses for the system as well. But there are a lot of shooters who want or prefer full frame. Even full frame though is kind of a misnomer. That's what we call it. It's 35mm film, but there's larger formats as well, medium format and large format that come in all shapes and sizes. And there are now digital cameras from Fuji, from Hasselblad, that give you that even larger sensor. So if all you care about is having the biggest sensor size, you're at a never-ending chase for the latest and greatest, most expensive thing. Sensor sizes can always get bigger, the lenses get bigger, and that can be your thing if you really like that look. But there's nothing wrong with a smaller sensor either. Micro Four Thirds, yes, is smaller than full frame, but it can still do shallow depth of field, it can do great resolution, all that stuff that you want. But there's always people who prefer full frame because it's kind of seemingly the standard for whatever reason. It's great to see that Lumix finally embraced this with their S cameras. So there was the S1, the S1H, the S1R, the S5, now the S5 Mark II with phase detect autofocus. And you can actually find an S5 Mark II right now used for like $1,200. They're really affordable when it comes to digital photography and digital video. Now, if you don't have any of these lenses, you will have to either adapt your current set, which you can't do if you have Micro Four Thirds, or if you're coming from Canon EF, you can find adapters that'll go to the new L mount, which is, for whatever reason, Lumix L mount, but they're the S cameras. It's a lot of variables to keep track of. But just know that the Lumix S5 Mark II has an L mount, which is full frame, and the Micro Four Thirds lenses won't work, but you can adapt from other systems, or you can buy native L mount lenses, which is what I would do. Nowadays, I do prefer having autofocus as well as some of the digital native features that come with the native lenses for these camera bodies. Long time ago, I used to adapt old Nikon vintage glass to Micro Four Thirds or other camera systems. I've kind of stopped doing that as much just because there's so many advantages when it comes to photography of having native glass. So if I were to buy an S5 Mark II, I would have to invest in brand new lenses. Unfortunately, I'm not really ready to do that just yet. Even though the camera body is only $1,200, $1,300, depending on where you're buying it from, that's used. You can find it, new for maybe $1,500, $1,600, something like that. I'm not ready to give up my Micro Four Thirds lenses because they're so good. I don't know if you've used the 10-25 or the 25-50 or the 50-200. There are some incredible, they're very expensive for Micro Four Thirds, so that's why I'm not eager to get rid of them, but they are beautiful glass. Some of the sharpest lenses I've ever used, and they're zooms, and they're fast, and they're just great. There's also the incredible Leica 42.5, which is a full frame 85mm equivalent. The 42.5 on the GH6 is gorgeous. It's a 1.2 It's super fast, very shallow depth of field. Of course, you can always go shallower with full frame, but I actually personally don't really like that. Back in the day when we were all getting into DSLR video with the 5D Mark II, full frame, ooh, that beautiful buttery bokeh, that shallow depth of field, I think it's kind of worn out its welcome in my opinion. I'm not a fan of the razor thin depth of field where an eyelash is in focus and everything else is just a smurry blur. It almost makes things look fake and out of place, like you green screened the whole thing. It at least can look like that in my opinion. I prefer something with a more reasonable traditional depth of field. So if you think of classic filmmaking and movies, a lot of times they were shooting Super 35 and they would shoot with an aperture around maybe f4 or 5.6 because pulling focus was hard and you didn't have these great autofocus systems with eye tracking and all that face detection kind of stuff. So they were giving themselves breathing room so that things could be in focus and it wasn't this hypercritical, super shallow depth of field of, you know, shooting at a 1.7 on a full frame camera or something like that. Much more reasonable. Super 35, you got a little bit more depth of field. I know that's kind of a misnomer, but it's the easiest way to think about it. The smaller the sensor, the deeper the depth of field. Not quite true, but go with me for a second. So you got micro four thirds. I can shoot at a 1.7 or a 1.2, but still have a little bit more in focus than I would with full frame. However, in an environment where you're doing high quality photography or you're doing certain types of video and you want that super shallow look, full frame is really the only way to get that. There's not really an option with micro four thirds. So it's up to the client, what your personal preference might be. For me, I really like micro four thirds. So that's not why I'm not eager to get rid of it. But when it comes to the S5 Mark II, if you wanted a full frame camera and you want all the great Lumix features like anamorphic, like shutter angle, like really high quality bit rates and codecs, the S5 Mark II basically has all of that on paper. Again, I haven't used it myself, so I can't really attest to it personally, but online it seems like almost everybody who has it is happy with it. And if you really need the premium features, there's the S5II, which allows for some SSD recording, which is not really my thing. I kind of like to keep everything small and lightweight, all right in the camera. I'll accessorize with, you know, monitors or displays or an extra battery maybe, but I don't like a bunch of stuff hanging onto my camera. I like it to be run and gun as much as possible. But there is the S5II if that's your preference. But I really like this camera. I think it's super cool that Lumix is pushing things forward in their full frame line with things like phase detect and offering all these incredible video features in a camera body that also takes great photos. But those lenses, that's where the trouble comes for me. There really isn't the full frame lens equivalent yet that kind of matches what I'm looking for when I'm coming from these great premium best of the best micro four third lenses. I bought them for a reason because they're incredible. And there really isn't the full frame equivalent. The full frame lenses are bigger, they're bulkier, they're heavier, and they're not cheaper either. So you can get some great primes. The L mount system has a lot of options when it comes to glass, but there isn't anything pulling me away from micro four thirds. Like those lenses for micro four thirds are really unique. A 10 to 25, 1.7, a 25 to 50, 1.7, you know, constant aperture throughout that focal range. You can't beat them in my opinion. Even the lenses from Canon and Sony are good, great, exceptional for their system. But for micro four thirds, there's something sweet, something special about that glass. So I just don't see a need to transition from micro four thirds with the GH6 and what I'm currently shooting with to another equivalent ecosystem that just means buying new glass and potentially selling my old stuff or keeping it and then just eating the cost on the new thing to ultimately get what is, yes, full frame, phase detect autofocus. If you don't have a camera, this is a great place to start because you don't have the burden of having a whole inventory in your gear room of really good equipment. You can start fresh. So yeah, I think the Lumix S5 Mark II is a great place to start if you're just getting into content creation, digital video, photography, that whole thing. The Lumix cameras offer some of the most features that I've ever seen in hybrid. Canon, Sony, they have their little strengths, but there's a lot of weaknesses too. And one of them for the longest time was autofocus. That Sony and Canon just had superior autofocus. Well, that's not really the case anymore. I know there are a few people who've had issues with the autofocus not being as good, but I think it's a step in the right direction. Hopefully the S5II can lead to an S1H Mark II or something like that, and we can keep seeing Lumix build out their full frame camera system, as well as supporting all the Micro Four Thirds shooters like myself, because I'm really looking forward to a GH7 or something like that. I've talked previously about the G9 Mark II, which is the Micro Four Thirds version of the S5 Mark II. Basically, the G9 Mark II has phase detect autofocus. It's like a GH6 with phase detect, minus a few features that are unique to the GH6. The G9 Mark II, I did a whole video about it. It's just a little bit too expensive for my taste. The S5 Mark II is a lot more reasonable in terms of price point, and if you're willing to invest in brand new lenses, go for it. I think it's a great investment for now and for the future, because on paper, the S5 Mark II does basically everything I could ever want and more. So let me know what your thoughts are. If you have an S5 or an S5 Mark II, let me know what it's like to use it. Or if you're thinking about buying one, let me know what's holding you back. For me personally, it's just the lens selection. The price point is great, but having to buy all new lenses would really take a toll on my wallet. And I'm just really happy with Micro Four Thirds currently. So I'm glad that there's more options for everybody now.